Introduction by Tim. Thank you very much, Tim, for that. I've been through one or two large-scale change processes over the years, both in the UK, in New Zealand, and most recently in Australia. And I'm a slightly unusual academic, as many of my friends will tell you, in that I've been a practitioner too before I joined academic life now, what, about 20 years ago, I suppose. A lot of what I'm going to say, and I'm happy for people to contact me afterwards, builds on work that I did with a group of American and European academics in a major academic journal, which is called the Academy of Management Journal. I can give references for the more academically minded. So when I talk about change as a process perspective, it's a question of where I am starting from. And I'm a great one for metaphor, and the way that I view change, and I might be slightly cynical, warranted, is that there's an impression that's often communicated that change should be this calm and serene event. If it's all logically planned and all carries through, then it should go smoothly and everything will be fine. And a lot of people sell a lot of methodology and consultancy hours on the back of that. The truth, in my experience, and the experience of lots of my friends and colleagues who are professional project managers, is that much of change is actually submerged. It goes on under the surface. Hence my iceberg metaphor, in that about 7/10 of what you see in change is actually hidden below the surface, and you only see the top quantity. And of course, rather like swans, those of us who lead change may look serene and calm on the exterior, but underneath the surface, the feet are going at several thousand revolutions per minute. It brings to mind a project I was involved in at the Royal Bank of Scotland, a large bank in the UK which got into trouble in the GFC. We had a 48-hour change process window when we switched over some customer records, 2 million records. So 48 hours, which went extremely smoothly, required 18 months of work to get us to look that smooth. And not all of that work was particularly calm. A lot of it was very frantic work. So hence, icebergs and swans, I think, the myth of change for me. Is change linear and orderly? It's often shown as linear and orderly in all the good textbooks. It will tell you that. But I think, as Tim indicated, and I'm sure some of you will have experienced, it's often not. And the reason often not is that people are involved, and people will intervene in plans if they're not properly engaged. So often you'll get accidents and derailments, literally and metaphorically, because people are involved. And those who may have caused that may well deny everything, and that's a clear experience of mine. I did work for a large financial services operation in Britain once, which once they had got rid of all of the project management team, went into chaos, so to speak. And indeed, the project eventually failed, which it shouldn't have done, having spent 20 million British pounds on it. So change may present it as linear and orderly, but very often it isn't, because of the factor that I'm going to turn to just now. And that is because what change really is about, and this draws on work in sociology of many years standing, is really about negotiating a new order, usually with a group of people of some size in many cases, either out of some form of disorder, and that is what we would call a turnaround in business circles, or an old order, where a change of strategy or some sort of threat to the organisation is suggesting that you need to move things along. Going back to an earlier example, my example there would be Halifax, something to do with Halifax Card Services in the UK. We had 2,500 call centre operators who were used to doing things in a particular way, and we had to change that particular way of doing things in a 2-month period. You can't simply instruct people to do that. There has to be negotiation around what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Another example would be British Airways, which was renowned throughout the 1970s to be the most disorderly, inefficient and ineffective airline in the world, despite it being, by their advertising, the world's most popular airline. What they had to do there was whole-scale change. How the new chairman carried it was by working with these huge mass of employees to negotiate a new order and a new way of operating. So that really, for me, is what change is about. It's about negotiating a new order. How do we go about doing that? Well, it isn't easy. If it was easy, we'd all do it on a regular basis. I have to get a Star Wars reference in. I can't really resist it, so I'll put one in. You'll forgive me for that. And there are some principles for what you're doing when you're negotiating. But when you come to change, my experience and the experience of others is that it's really about establishing the principles of engagement with colleagues who you're working with. The most important thing of all, and this is a lesson for everyone, and it's something that I've found, is you have to separate people from issues, unless it really is about the people. Because what happens is that people get attached to ways of working, ways of doing things, and somebody comes along and says, well, we're going to change that. If they're very attached, they don't have sufficient bandwidth to make the change or whatever, then you go off into another area of management, which is referred to often as fierce conversations, where some fairly blunt home truths may be given over to people. The idea is that you have to take the emotion out of the argument wherever possible. The idea is that you should focus on issues, not on positions. People will very often say in change, well, this is my bottom line. Well, the bottom line is a position. It doesn't help to achieve where it is that perhaps an organisation needs to go. So in that sense, and this comes out of the American Principal Negotiation School developed at Harvard, the need is to generate options for mutual gain, to try and demonstrate that there is benefit in changing an organisation or a way of operating. And part of achieving that means finding some form of objective criteria to establish benefits. Inevitably, in commercial organisations, that may well be revenue. It could be return on investment. In healthcare organisations, it might be the efficiency of use of beds. It may well be some other measure of performance in the area of healthcare, where I hasten to add, I have no particular expertise. I think an interesting example, though, is one that's used in Harvard, which was an organisation. This is how you get change really moving. The San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, many years ago, got into a bit of a state between the players and the people who organised the trust upon which the symphony was based. Basically, they weren't talking to each other. So you had a community of musicians and you had a community of trustees, and they were at war with each other. And a guy called Robert Mnookin from the Harvard Law School was asked to intervene and came in. And what he basically did to solve this impasse, to get them to actually change so the orchestra could survive, was he actually trained them to negotiate. He actually said, this is how we're going to negotiate to order. We're going to stop arguing over points of position, and we're going to start to say, what is it we want to achieve? We want to be a world-class orchestra. We want to have this particular principle in place that enables us to work together. And it worked, so much so that the next time they came around to do the negotiation over the musicians' pay, that actually by the time they got to the bargaining room, it was all done and dusted, and it took about a week. Contrast that with in universities, bargaining that can take anything up to 18 months. That's not just my university, I hasten to add, that's all universities across the world. So its negotiating order is a particularly important skill when it comes to dealing with change. Now, I said a process view, and one of the best processes that I know, and Tim, you're right, I've always called it PROSCI. I'm told reliably by people who've been trained it's called PROSCI. This is just one example of sorts of process. The reason I like it is because it's based essentially around changing culture. It's not obsessed with, if you like, a normative approach to change, whereby you try and change things. It's actually about how you get people to move through different parts of an experience. So it's a process-based rather than an artifact-based approach to change. And I actually found this this little graphic that I've used only the other day, and the reason I really like it is because it communicates that we can all have the ability to change by training in skills and behaviours, and we can all have the knowledge of how to change, and we can all get an appreciation of reinforcement through rewarding change and so on. But if they're not built on the desire to participate and support change, and if they're not built on clear understanding and awareness of the need for change, then all of the ability, all of the knowledge, however well reinforced, will not bring about lasting change, because none of the preceding conditions within this cultural process, as I've referred to it, are going to work. And we see this in spades, I'm afraid, and I always go back to this example in the British banking industry in the GFC. There were clear signs that they needed to change, and they had all of the ability to change, they had all of the knowledge to change, they'd been given all encouragement by regulators, some not positively encouraging, but other forms of encouragement, threatening in other words. But there was neither the awareness that they really needed to change nor the desire. And in the end, we saw the gross failure of large banks because their senior management did not want to change, and they weren't really aware that they needed to. So this is just one approach I've put here. The thing I like is it doesn't give you a flowchart. It's about developing a culture for an organisation or a group of organisations. It doesn't emphasise the plan, it emphasises the people, and I think that's the most important thing in taking this particular approach. So let's just have a little look around what the different elements really are talking about. And really, if we're talking about awareness, this is where it all starts. And it may well be self-awareness, but it's awareness particularly in organisations of the need to really communicate why is it that we need to change? What is it that is causing issues for the organisations, or what is it about the need to move to a better future? That needs to be communicated quite clearly and succinctly, usually by the chief executive or certainly by a senior person within the organisation. One of the keys to building awareness is to give colleagues access to information. The old expression is that rumour rushes in to fill a void when information is not available. And that, in my experience, happens in all sorts of organisations when I've been involved in change, because there's a gap and then somebody will create a rumour that something horrible is going to happen usually. Events too can communicate the need for change, and we saw events, and I'll go back to it again, financial services sector, we saw events overtaking everything else, which communicated the need to restructure the entire banking industry. But we see it in other organisations as well. The British car industry in the late 1970s was quite obviously failing and needed to change, and there were events that communicated that. So you get this idea of an observable condition that really communicates that there is an issue that is going to have to be dealt with at some point. There are all sorts of examples. I've not put the examples up of how you go about doing this, but we're broadly, at my institution, and I'm delighted to be involved with it, we're broadly changing the organisational culture through a number of approaches that we're taking at the university. A lot of effort goes into our chief executive, the Chancellor Barney Glover's effort around messaging. He spends a great deal of time messaging through internal means and through external means. He's a great one for engaging in conversation at all sorts of levels within the organisations, and puts a great deal of effort into employment communications. I've seen this in other organisations as well over the years. That is absolutely key, is an availability of information. It shouldn't all have to be about catastrophic failure. It shouldn't all have to be about weakening financial performance. Just, it is nice to be involved in positive change that's not promoted by the need to earn more revenue. But all of this can get subverted by a number of issues. People do get comfortable in situations. People do like the status quo, and they will tend to subvert a change process where they deem that to be under threat. In most cases, it's usually something to do with parking or something to do with office accommodation, to be honest, over the years. There may also be an issue with the credibility of a change leader, particularly in an organisation that has gone through a number of changes. Where a leader's been involved in those changes, then you will find that colleagues may well try and undermine people. There will be denial of the need to change. There's nothing wrong with what we're doing. Why do we need to change? There is no need to. There may well be debate. Certainly there are rumours or misinformation, and the main barrier to change I've found over the years, and this is confirmed by a lot of research by people, particularly in America, Irving Yanis founded the idea of groupthink, or you might recognise it as pack mentality, and that is that a group of people who have a broadly similar worldview will get together and say, no, we're not going to change, we don't need to, there is nothing wrong. And it's usually where their comfort or their status quo is threatened. I was trying to think about examples, and it's difficult to give examples that aren't sort of kind of close to home. But I thought of one around a credit card company that I worked with, whereby the people who worked in the call centres were clearly very anti having anything changed because they were used to working with a particular computer system. So it was very difficult there to raise awareness of the need to change. But it's all about really reflecting what you need to. What about desire? I love this graphic. I found it on Flickr, and it kind of communicates a lot. If we just ignore Dubois, wherever that is, we can see the key things in building desire: paradise towards paradise, incentivization, the fear of risk or panic, and the desire to belong. This is all how you build the desire, build the need to actually want to move to change. And the way that typically you would build desire is to demonstrate some incentive. It will be better moving forward. You have to try and quell the fear of risk, in that they're usually when people, particularly, and it's back to this idea of the status quo, when people are concerned about change, I wouldn't say they begin to panic, but they do begin to be concerned that this might impair what they have, and they already feel what they have is actually pretty good. So a way of getting around that is to actually demonstrate that there's a desire to belong to something better, a demonstration that something will improve in your approach to work. Of course, if you have a very strong, very charismatic leader, then in many cases you will see a willingness to actually follow a leader. For all of his faults and character flaws, Steve Jobs is a great example here, whereby he was renowned to be an awfully difficult person to work with and for at times, but had a level of charisma that enabled him to actually take Apple and transform it after it had fallen on hard times when he'd been edged out in the 1980s. Of course, there is the time-honoured tradition of demonstrating that the alternative to the change is actually worse. My experience of that is that very often doesn't work, because people will say, well, it can't be worse because we're already doing it, unless it's serious failure. The barriers to this, as I say, the status quo rises again. There is the fear of the unknown. You can't promise me that that is going to work. There is, of course, good old-fashioned self-interest, what's referred to as WIIFM, what's in it for me, not very often enlightened. There may well be a low confidence of success in change, and usually that comes out of poor personal experiences or poor organisational experiences in the past. That goes back to my earlier comment, where you may well have an issue with the credibility of a leader or a leadership team who've tried to effect change previously and have actually failed. Nothing has worked, and there are one or two examples of that around in organisations, some retail organisations actually, where people have tried to effect change. Dare I say it, Qantas sort of hints that it might be in that sort of place, and that there's been change after change after change, and there's still a question around how well it is performing. How do you overcome these sort of things? Leadership, an active and visible sponsor of the change. So you will see people really getting up there, putting themselves out there to actually try and make that change occur. I go back to the example of jobs. You could go to all sorts of examples from the high-tech space there. You have to have a coalition of the willing. One of the ways to really effect change, or to get the desire for change effectively, is to have a group of champions who will drive it forward for you. This is a very common occurrence in commercial organisations. We also need to see engagement by management teams and engagement of colleagues in actually taking the change forward. And best of all, if you can get employees and colleagues to actually create their own solutions, then so much the better. One of the approaches that I like to see used is something that's called appreciative inquiry, which comes out of the Case Western Reserve University in the United States. David Cooperrider and Ron Fry are the two main leaders of that movement. That's been used all over the States. It's been used all over Australia and Europe. It's been used in everything from health care organisations to the United States Navy to universities. All sorts of places have used it. Basically, it takes a positive outlook on the future and uses employees and colleagues to actually design the change process that you want to get to go to that positive future. That's a particularly valuable technique that's quite well known. Of course, the other way of developing desire is to incentivize people. That might include money, but it may well also include changes to accommodation. If you want to move people to different type of office accommodation, it may well involve giving somebody a window view. Goodness knows. There's all sorts of ways that people get incentive. Very often it's monetary incentives that are considered, but there is so much more to that, and so much more in management theory around non-monetary incentives that's worth considering. In a sense, those are the two sort of the difficult parts: building the awareness and the desire. And it's my experience is it's something that's very often rushed through, because it's assumed that you can just do that. Oh, I'm going to lead change, we're going to do it. And it's a little bit like sometimes, for those of you who've done a PhD or some other form of doctorate, you'd be aware that the actual PhD process is as much about preparing to get the field work done as it is about executing the field work. The more effort you put into the preparation, the more straightforward the field work should be. At least that's the principle. And I'm sat with one of my colleagues here who I hope will bear that out. In a sense, the easier parts are now upon us in this idea of a change process in terms of building knowledge. Knowledge can be built through training and education, through experience, through access to information, and through my particular favourite, which is mentoring. There's still a very strong pace, in my experience, in change for the master-apprentice model. I believe, and that's certainly how I learned a great deal about my change management knowledge. The barriers are more straightforward to overcome. They very often refer to resources. Resources in terms of a gap between the present and the desired knowledge, and that's a question of training and education. Typically speaking, there may be inadequate resources of training in a change management plan. I ran a large training work stream in a large change management plan at a credit card company, and that was under-resourced for a long time until I actually sat down, did the homework, and demonstrated just how much needs to go in to resourcing the training. In that case, 2,500 call centre operators over a 3-month period. That needed a lot of money to go into that, and a lot of technical resources too. The other barriers as well refer to a lack of access to information. That helps to explain the graphic that I chose there, and that having the confidence to give people the knowledge or make the knowledge available will tend to carry them. My experience where change goes wrong very often is that insufficient knowledge or insufficient access to knowledge is given. You have to be careful with some information clearly, particularly in commercial organisations or where there's a legal issue, but nevertheless knowledge does aid hugely. The other factor as well is a lack of capacity to learn, and that's a pet subject with me, is that one thing we're actually typically not very good at broadly in education, not just my university, is that we don't actually teach people how to learn terribly well, neither at school nor at university. And so people's capacity to learn needs to be taken into account. There are all sorts of examples how you can go about doing this. You can have formal training, be it in a university setting, be it in a school setting, be it in a professional setting. You can have job aids. They may well be people helping people, or they could be computer systems helping people, workflow management system. That is a trend that's going on, as we're all aware, in terms of how we help people manage their daily jobs. One-on-one coaching, I've been very lucky. I've benefited from that in my present role for quite some time, where I had a senior executive coach who came in to try my ideas out as I went through being a dean and on into being my present role as an assistant vice chancellor. User groups and forums are fantastic. We're working at this university on a higher education accreditation to do with business schools. The most valuable piece of learning we get is not the seminars from the organisation that gives the accreditation, but is actually the user groups and forums that actually circle around that whole accreditation process. We've also seen that to be very successful in our own cultural assessment at UWS, which is called My Voice, and we've seen user groups working on particular issues for change across the past 18 months, and that's been particularly successful. Then we come to the ability to change. How do you build the ability? How do you build people's confidence in actually doing it? It is a matter largely of time. It's a matter of practice, of coaching, of access to the right tools and feedback. But the graphic's quite instructive there, and that is that it really is, and this I've seen this time and again in one bank, one credit card company, in another business school I worked in, another university I worked in all of the companies that I've worked with over the years. And that is, those that have been more successful are those whereby the majority of colleagues have a growth mindset. And that is that you can always learn something. You can always change with some effort. And that's the key to that. Because then you can offer up practice, you can offer up time, you can offer up coaching, appropriate tools, great feedback and mentoring from other people, get coaches involved, give people access to experts. Look at performance monitoring. Performance monitoring gets a bad name, and that's because very often it's done badly. Where there is good performance monitoring, which is constructive, helping to build people up, that works particularly well. And the barriers are all, of course, the antithesis of all of those good things that I've talked about, where time is pressing, where there's a lack of time, where there is a lack of support, where people's bad habits are allowed to keep coming in, Where there is a negative mindset or negative psychology, if you want, within the organisation, physical limits, personal limitation. I'm not talking about just creating sort of a, if you like, an open slather on positive opportunities, but nevertheless, it's to be aware that there needs to be sufficient resourcing involved to give people that ability. And then this is the thing that is, apart from the two earlier phases, it's reinforcement that can be forgotten. How do we reinforce the change? We celebrate it. It doesn't have to involve money. It doesn't have to involve a party, but there should be some form of celebration. Very often, you through just giving non-monetary rewards, giving recognition, just a short certificate. My personal experience of this was in my former school here, where we were looking at ways to celebrate what had been a very difficult period of change for us, and we came up with the idea of a very simple rewards ceremony, whereby the people who were rewarded were not the people who were the world beaters, the champions. They were the people who turned up to work every day, did their job, but did it very well, and enabled other people to do their job very well. And they were selected by the managers, not by me when I was dean, not by my deputy dean, but by the people who managed them on a day-to-day basis. That worked extremely well. So some reward and recognition, good feedback. It's difficult to do if you have a lot of colleagues reporting to you, but nevertheless, good feedback is good. Gentle and firm corrective action where something is not working. You can't just continue if somebody's not working appropriately. You can't continue. You've got to say, look, we're trying to get here. We need to get you there. It needs to be done quite well. The best way to do that is visible performance measurement and accountability as well. The barriers are what they are, as I said there, where rewards just don't mean anything. And that is they're done either in the absence of anybody understanding what they are, where there's a complete absence of reinforcement. Project managers, by the way, are very bad at this. Project managers always want to move on to the next project. So beware the project manager, says he, who is a professional project manager. There may be some negative consequences of behaviours which can make it very difficult to reinforce. And there are incentives that can counter change that may not. Now that means that there hasn't been enough preparation done in the first place. So success. How do we prepare for success? How do we develop success? Quote from Colin Powell there. No secrets to success. It's the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. Preparation, it's what I said earlier. We do not typically organisations spend nearly enough time on awareness building and promoting desire. We just jump into the hard work of promoting of the plan, if you like. Let's get into the plan, let's get on with it, let's